Hi, and welcome to today's News Currents. Today is September 11th, 2024. Live fact check. Trump, Harris debate immigration, abortion, and crime rates. It's the second presidential debate of the election season, with the first between Vice President Harris and former President Donald Trump, and their first time ever meeting in person. A lot has changed since the June debate between Trump and President Biden, whose poor showing prompted party concerns that ultimately saw him drop out of the race. With the candidates virtually tied in the polls and just 55 days until Election Day, Trump and Harris are meeting on stage in Philadelphia for their first and possibly only debate. It's all about the middle class for middle-class kid Harris. Vice President Harris repeatedly leaned into her middle-class roots at the debate, seeking to contrast her childhood as the daughter of immigrants to former President Donald Trump's experience being born into a wealthy family. Harris opened the debate underscoring the contrast as she answered a question about whether Americans are better off now than they were 4 years ago, saying Trump wants to pay for tax cuts for billionaires and on the backs of middle-class people. I was raised as a middle-class kid, and I am actually the only person on this stage who has a plan that is about lifting up the middle class and working people of America, she said. My opponent, on the other hand, has a plan to do what he has done before, which is provide a tax cut for billionaires and big corporations. Harris went on to attack Trump's economic plans, including his call for steep tariffs on most foreign imports as a 20% tax on everyday goods that you rely on to get through the month. That would result in families paying $4,000 more a year. Later, when asked about why some of her policy positions have changed, including on fracking, Harris said she would not ban the drilling technique. Then she pivoted back to the theme of growing as middle class, saying her values have not changed. As it relates to my values, let me tell you, I grew up a middle-class kid raised by a hardworking mom who worked and saved up and was able to buy our first home when I was a teenager, she said. Then attacked Trump. The values I bring to the importance of home ownership, knowing not everyone got handed $400 million on a silver platter and then filed bankruptcy 6 times. Trump responded that he hadn't been giving $400 million, but a tiny fraction of that, which he said he built into many, many billions of dollars. Trump keeps saying foreign wars wouldn't have happened if he were in office. Trump says that Israel-Hamas and Russia-Ukraine wars would not have happened if he were president. That's one of his favorite refrains. He repeatedly insisted those conflicts are related to President Biden's election and vowed that he would resolve them quickly if reelected. He said that he could end the war in Ukraine within 24 hours, but declined to elaborate how. He told Fox Sean Hannity last year that would be a very easy negotiation, but didn't want to show his hand. Chris Stirewalt, a senior fellow at the American Enterprise Institute, told NPR this year that Trump makes complex foreign policy sound simple, and people believe him. The authoritarian tendency in politics, not just in the United States, but anywhere, is to say that there is a simple and easy answer. Stirewalt said, but the bad people will not let you obtain it because they're weak or they're corrupt. Trump won't say whether he'd veto a national abortion ban. When pressed on whether he would veto a national abortion ban into law if one were to come to his desk, Trump declined to get specific. Harris warned that if elected, Trump will sign a national abortion ban. Trump has repeatedly called for leaving abortion policy to the states, but anti-abortion rights activists, who make up a key part of the Republican base, have called on Republican elected officials to work toward national abortion restrictions. Passage of a federal abortion ban would require Republicans to control both the presidency and both houses of Congress. In one exchange, Trump reiterated a campaign pledge not to sign such a law. It's a lie. I'm not signing a ban. And there's no reason to sign a ban, says Trump. Later adding, it doesn't matter because this issue has not been taken over by the states. Asked by a moderator if he would veto such a bill if it came before him, Trump responded, I won't have to. He then changed the subject to student loan policy. After the moderator noted that Trump's running mate, Ohio Senator J.D. Vance, has said he would veto such a law, Trump said, well, I didn't discuss it with J.D. in all fairness. He went on, we don't have to discuss it because she'd never be able to get it, suggesting that Democrats are unlikely to get the votes to pass a bill that would enshrine abortion rights. Trump makes false claim about non-citizens voting. It is illegal for non-citizens to vote in federal elections, and there is no credible evidence that it has happened in significant numbers, or there is an effort underway to illegally register undocumented immigrants to vote in this election. Voter registration forms require voters to sign an oath, under penalty of perjury, that they are U.S. citizens. If a non-citizen lies about their citizenship on a registration form and vote, they have created a paper trail of crime that is punishable with jail time and deportation. The deterrent is incredibly strong, David Becker, executive director of Center for Election Innovation and Research, told NPR. Election officials routinely verify information on voter registration forms, which ask registrants for either a driver's license number or the last four of social security numbers. In 2016, the Brennan Center for Justice surveyed local election officials in 42 jurisdictions with high immigrant populations and found 30 cases of suspected non-citizens voting out of 23.5 million votes cast, or 0.001%. Georgia Secretary of State Brad Raffensperger launched an audit in 2022 that found fewer than 1,700 suspected non-citizens had attempted to register to vote over the past 25 years. None were able to vote. The Polaris Dawn spacewalk is SpaceX's risky adventure. A SpaceX rocket lifted off early Tuesday morning carrying 4 astronauts who hope to conduct the world's first commercial spacewalk. The launch from the Kennedy Space Center in Florida marks the beginning of one of SpaceX's highest-stakes missions yet. If all goes as expected, in a matter of days, internet entrepreneur Jared Isaacman and SpaceX engineer Sarah Gillis will be the first private astronauts to exit their spacecraft to float above the Earth in spacesuits. They'll be treated to a majestic view of the planet that's only been seen by professional astronauts working on official missions from their space agencies. But experts warn there's plenty that could go wrong. Spacewalking carries unique risks compared to traveling inside a capsule or visiting the International Space Station. This mission will use several components that have never been tested in space before, including the spacesuits themselves, and it will require a skill and cool-headed thinking from the astronauts involved, 3 of whom have never been to space at all. Conducting a spacewalk like this is a risky adventure, acknowledges Bill Gerstenmaier, SpaceX's vice president of Build and Flight Reliability, who previously headed NASA's human spaceflight operations. But he insists that the company is ready. We're going to do it as safely as we can, and we've got the right protocols, and we've done the right testing to get ready to go, Gerstenmaier told reports at a press briefing last month. A giant leap for a prize. The mission known as Polaris Dawn is a giant leap for commercial space travel. To date, most space tourists have either taken a brief suborbital journey that provides a few moments of weightlessness, or, for significantly more money, travel to the International Space Station. Isaacman spent a few days in 2021 orbiting Earth in a SpaceX capsule. From left, Scott Poteet, Anna Menon, Sarah Gillis, Jared Isaacman are set to conduct the first private spacewalk. Gillis and Isaacman will exit their Dragon capsule, float above the Earth in new spacesuits from the commercial flight company SpaceX. He's now paid an undisclosed sum of money for this mission, which is the first of 3 scheduled as part of the Polaris program. Isaacman had floated the idea of the second mission being used to service the Hubble Space Telescope, but NASA recently said that the agency would not pursue it at this time because they're not sure it's worth the risks. On this mission, our 4 astronauts will don new SpaceX spacesuits before purging the air from their Dragon capsule. Isaacman, the mission commander, and Gillis will then open the hatch and float briefly out of the capsule, connected by umbilical cords that will supply them with oxygen. The mission's pilot, Scott Poteet, a medical officer and SpaceX employee, Anna Menon, will remain inside the capsule. The allure of doing a spacewalk is clear. The view is stunning, says Luca Parmatino, an astronaut for the European Space Agency who has conducted 6 spacewalks. It's almost as if time stops for a second, or if your heart stops for a second. It's just so beautiful, he says. But Parmatino says that spacewalking is also physically and mentally challenging. The suits are pressurized, making them stiff and inflexible. At one point during the spacewalk, you're going to be hot, you're going to be cold, your hands are going to hurt. He says, you have to embrace the suck. And there's a lot that can go wrong. During a spacewalk outside the International Space Station in 2013, Parmitano's helmet began filling with water from his spacesuit's cooling system. In 0G, the capillary pressure caused the water to stick to his skin and begin creeping around his head. It covered my eyes, it covered my ears, it went inside my nose, Parmitano calls. He wasn't able to communicate because his radio no longer worked. I was on my own, isolated. I couldn't see anything. I couldn't hear. I couldn't talk. Heating up. Spacewalks, known as the business as extravehicular activities, or EVAs, have always been among the most dangerous parts of space travel. During the first American spacewalk, carried out during the Gemini program of the 1960s, crew members frequently experienced problems with their suits, according to Emily Margolis, a curator of contemporary spaceflight at the Smithsonian National Air and Space Museum. Of the 9 EVAs that took place during the Project Gemini, 3 of them actually ended early due to concerns over health and safety, Margolis says. For example, on Gemini 9, astronaut Gene Cernan was supposed to test a kind of rocket pack to help astronauts move around in space. His suit included a metallic coating to protect him from the exhaust of the rocket pack, but the coating made it far harder to move. One of the paradoxes of spacewalking is that although space is cold, the lack of atmosphere around the suit can actually cause heat to build up inside. As Cernan struggled to move, he ended up overexerting himself. He started to sweat profusely, and the moisture in the suit started to fog his visor, Margolis said. With his visibility severely impaired, his crewmate cut the EVA short and brought him back inside. When Cernan returned to Earth, Margolis says it was determined he'd lost 13 pounds over the mission. It's believed that most of that was water weight, but the amount that he was sweating during this EVA, she says. Spacewalks have become more routine since then, but they remain risky. According to Jonathan Clark, a physician at Baylor College of Medicine who consulted for both NASA and SpaceX on spacesuits, by his count, around 1 in 5 spacewalks encounter some sort of problem. Sometimes you can adapt to it, but a lot of times you've got to stop the EVA and come back in, he says. In the case of Luca Parmitano, the astronaut whose helmet began filling with water, He had little choice but to cut the spacewalk short. Because he couldn't see, he had to work his way back to the airlock from memory. Eventually, fellow spacewalker Chris Cassidy helped him get back inside and close the hatch. I don't take any specific credit for keeping my cool, because I'd been trained my whole life to perform in relatively risky situations, says Parmitino, who is also a colonel and test pilot in the Italian Air Force. New challenges. Clark notes that the Polaris Dawn crew has had far less experience of the 4 crew members. Only Isaacman has actually been to space. Beyond that, none of the crew has done an actual spacewalk before, he says. It's going to be a first for everybody. The crew will be wearing new SpaceX suits that in some ways resemble those worn by earlier generations of astronauts. They will be fed by oxygen by an umbilical cord connected to the spacecraft, and the suits themselves will be passively cooled with air from the umbilical. That means there's no chance of a water leak, like what happened to Parmitano. But overheating similar to the Gemini missions could become an issue, as could fogging of the astronauts' visors. Moreover, of the Dragon capsule itself will have to continue to operate smoothly under vacuum. Without air circulating, the capsule's onboard computers will have a harder time keeping cool. The challenges are certainly there, Clark says, but newbies can do tough things in space. Sean Proctor was the pilot of Isaacman's first mission to orbit the Earth in 2021. Until 6 months before the launch, she'd never flown a rocket. I basically went from being a geoscience professor to being a mission pilot for a spacecraft, she says. Proctor says SpaceX got her ready. In fact, Sarah Gillis helped train her for her mission. Another member of this latest crew, Scott Poteet, was the mission director for her launch. While Proctor's brief flight took only 6 months to prepare for, this latest mission has been in the works for more than 2 years, allowing for much more training. Proctor says, if anyone can carry out the first commercial spacewalk, it's this team. The crew is amazing, she says. They are also competent at what they do. Life coach or therapist, know the differences. Life coach, wellness coach, business coach, weight loss coach, breakup coach, the list goes on and on. All are different titles for similar jobs with the same limitation. Anyone can claim to be an expert. Health coaching alone is a $7.6 billion market in the United States, linked to the wellness and lifestyle medicine industries, as well as social media influencer culture. With ongoing shortages of physicians and mental health workers, many Americans see coaches as more personalized alternative to traditional physical and mental health care. Yet, the profession is poorly regulated, which can make it a utopia for scammers. Untrained people providing advice about health, psychology, and nutrition, and in some cases, cult-like behavior, such as coach encouraging customers to cut ties with family and friends. And now that AI health coaching has entered the chat, these problems are likely to grow. As a licensed clinical social worker who specializes in mental health and public health, I have observed coaching's growing popularity and how patient interest appears to stem from a lack of affordable and accessible mental health care. Coaches have the potential to fill a gap and work alongside therapists to assist clients. Many people seek coaching to help them make a big decision or hold them accountable for making progress toward a set goal, from launching a business to sticking to their wellness routines. But the industry is unregulated. However, it's important for people to understand its limits before using a coach's services. Why is coaching so popular? In broad terms, coaches assist someone in creating a plan for achieving specific goals. For example, making a change in their career, diet, or relationships. It can be effective in helping people manage chronic conditions such as diabetes, between doctor's visits, and to follow their treatment plan. Amid COVID-19, physical and mental health care became more difficult to access, which may have contributed to coaches' popularity. People who were skeptical of the healthcare system have turned to coaches in hopes of one-on-one specialized treatment. Another contributing factor may be the rise of the gig economy, with coaching appealing to many people wanting to be self-employed. Social media and the internet have also fueled coaching popularity by making it easier to research and receive health advice, regardless of whether the advice is accurate. Is coaching therapy? The simple answer is no. While resembling therapy, coaching does not require licensing, credentials, or formal education. Practicing therapists, on the other hand, are required to be in good standing with the law, have years of training, are regulated by governing bodies and professional associations, and abide by licensing bodies' guidelines to keep the client safe. There's a common stereotype that coaching is for high-functioning people and is oriented towards the future. While therapy is focused on the past and finding problems with people, as a licensed practicing therapist, I think this could not be farther from the truth. Therapists focus on helping a person process their past, focus on the present, and work towards the goals in the future. In my experience, I find that these falsities reinforce the stigma around mental health and keep people from getting the appropriate help. According to one academic study, 25% to 50% of people engaging with a life coach have mental health conditions that require a higher level of support. And even though many coaches are savvy in therapy speak, they often lack the training to recognize when the client needs are beyond what they should be providing. Risks and regulation. One of the biggest concerns about coaching is that it lacks a central governing body to regulate oversee members. The industry has taken some step toward better oversight, and there's one established accrediting body, the International Coaching Federation. It is not a requirement, however, for people identifying as coaches to join this organization. Certifications can be provided by anyone or any program, but training is not standardized. The lack of regulation means anyone can provide coaching, including therapists who lost their licenses for unethical conduct. It has also led to social media coaches and influencers spreading misinformation and confusion about mental health conditions. This is concerning because non-licensed providers, including coaches, are legally not allowed to diagnose mental health conditions. Because non-licensed providers, including coaches, are legally not allowed to diagnose mental health conditions such as depression or anxiety, or provide treatment for them. Another concern is coaching clients' vulnerability to being scammed financially. Mistreated or given dangerous advice such as abusive child rearing suggestions, coaching clients do not have the legal rights that therapy clients have, such as patient confidentiality. Finally, life coaching relies heavily on positive psychology, which focuses on personal strengths and positive traits for happiness. In short, to look on the bright side and not focus on the negatives, since its founding, positive psychology has come under scrutiny for debunked scientific claims of the therapy's success, and while this approach works for me, others find that it is too individualistic, not giving enough weight to how external issues, such as systematic racism, can play a role in mental health. What to look for? Ultimately, each person's needs are individual, and a life coach might be helpful. However, there are some considerations to keep in mind during initial consult. What training does the coach have? What's their background? I recommend looking into their education and licensing, as well as any titles or certificates that you find unfamiliar. Is someone telling you that they can cure you, or they can have a product that can fix your problem, a meal plan, diet, coaching course, etc.? Do they have research and evidence, not just anecdote, to back up the claims they are making? If something is being touted or tested or proven, make sure you ask about the data. Is the person touting their service as the only way to get better? Are they making unrealistic claims, such as being able to cure someone of their trauma symptoms in 1 month? A credible life coach is not going to promise to completely change your life or cure you. Is there a formal contract with the services provided clearly laid out? Does this contract discuss limitations of services provided? Is there clarity around fees and charges? Is the coach willing to be flexible about their approach? Do they become defensive when you ask questions? Life coaching has the potential to be evidence-based, short-term practice, but potential clients need to carefully consider whether it is appropriate for them. Native-led suicide prevention program focuses on building community strengths. Alaska Yukon Kuskokwim Delta is one of the nation's most remote regions, stretching across 75,000 square miles of mountains, tundra, and coastal wetlands across the Bering Sea. The U.S. Census counts the population at roughly 27,000, the majority of whom are Alaska natives of Yupik and Athabascan descent, placing the region among the most sparsely populated areas in the United States. There are no roads connecting the Delta's 50 villages to the national system. It's also home to the nation's highest rates of suicide. Since the 50s, mental health experts say that suicide prevention models have largely been designed to identify and mitigate risk through an individualized approach, treating symptoms like anxiety or suicidal ideation through therapy or counseling. But as suicide rates have steadily risen over the past few decades, a group of Indigenous researchers at the Center for Alaska Native Health Research have been developing a new approach across the villages of the YK Delta. Over several decades, CanHR has designed programs that aim to build up a community's endemic strengths, rather than solely treating the risk facing individuals within that community. By providing support and resources that enable access to Alaska Native cultural activities, they hope to strengthen social bonds that build resilience. Their approach has shown such promise that it's now being piloted in the Alaska's military population, another demographic highly impacted by suicide, with hopes that the model could scale both nationally and abroad. A people in peril. For decades, it's been common to see headlines that highlight the wide spectrum of challenges confronting the YK Delta: the lingering psychological impacts of residential boarding schools, high rates of substance abuse and sexual violence stemming from generational trauma, dwindling salmon runs that limit food and livelihood, and a changing climate that is threatening low-lying village communities along the coast with flooding and erosion. But the researchers at CanHR, who work out of the University of Alaska Fairbanks, believe that all this focus on risks might actually be part of the problem. They say that as a result, these communities are often viewed solely through the prism of their challenges, while funders and research groups across the field of suicide prevention have dedicated too little attention and resources towards the approaches that emphasize their inherent strengths. We've been trying risk education approaches for nearly half a century, says Stacy Rasmus, the director at CanHR, and we are not moving the needle with those approaches. The origins of CanHR's innovative prevention efforts can be traced, in part, to the conversations that emerged in response to intense media coverage of the problems confronting the communities of the YK Delta. In the 1980s, the Anarch Daily News published a Pulitzer Prize-winning series called A People in Peril, which described a burgeoning crisis of suicide and substance use in Alaska's bush villages. The Alaska Federation of Natives came out after that and said, yes, that's a reality, but that's not who we are, says Rasmus. Rasmus, who is Indigenous, says that those articles failed to capture the positives that also exist in village communities. We need our young people to know that they're not vanishing. They're not all drowning in a river of brews. That was literally a title of one of the People in Peril article, says Rasmus. Actually, the large majority of Alaska Native people are living their essential ways of life. Indigenous people are here and have these strengths. Subsequently, a group of leaders from Alkunk, one of the villages named in the article, approached CanHR to collaborate on an action plan that would focus on building up the community strengths that already existed in the local Yupik culture, rather than treating the individual risks identified by the series like substance use and depression. Implementing a community-based program required a break from decades of common practice in suicide prevention, which has historically tended toward an individualized medical approach, often in a clinical setting. As a former village clinician in the YK Delta, Rasmus has seen firsthand the need for a different strategy. I went and lived out in Emonak for 3 years before realizing that a clinician's toolkit wasn't going to help. During her tenure in the village as an unlicensed clinician fresh out of graduate school, Rasmus was immediately confronted by 8 consecutive youth suicides. Rasmus found herself facing a lot of difficult questions from the community. What's going on with our young people? What can we do? You're a mental health clinician. Fix it. But Rasmus struggled to get her young patients to open up. She remembers one young man who walked in, took his hoodie strings, put his head down and tightened it up, and that was it. This young man was never going to say one word to me. Panic John, on the right, teaches her granddaughter, Bernadette Wiseman, on the left, how to process a baby seal using traditional ulak knife at their home in Toksook Bay, Alaska. Panic and her husband, Simon, lead CanHR's program and research projects in Toksook Bay, including Gunzavik. In search for a more effective approach, CanHR embarked on a research project that could come to span decades, traveling to 7 different villages across the YK Delta to meet and collaborate with elders and local leadership. Through interviews and conversations, they identified positive qualities within the communities that are protective against suicide, such as cultural traditions surrounding Alaska Native food, hunting, music, and storytelling. These protective factors have been foundational to more than a dozen student studies that followed. Funded by the National Institutes of Health and Substance Abuse and Mental Health Services administrations. The culmination of these efforts are a flagship program called Gunzavik, a Yupik word meaning toolkit, which aims to reduce a suicide risk by providing youth with culturally grounded activities and learning. Rasmus has been helping oversee Gunzavik for the last 15 years. In a Yupik worldview, suicide is not a mental health disorder, and it's not an individual affliction. It's a disruption of the collective, she says, and so the solution to suicide needs to be at the community level. Simon John speaks about Gunzavik with the group of students at the Lower Gugosmim Dance Festival in Twinnik, Alaska. I don't like to think of it as a program. A program is something that has an ending, he explains. I want to say, Yurik, a way of life. Tools for life. Every week in the coastal village of Hooper Bay, a local dance group gets together for practice in the Tribal Council building. In this village of roughly 1,300 people in Alaska's YK Delta, public spaces are scarce, so the room gets used for council meetings during the day and events at night. Tables and bingo machines have been swept to the side, and rows of folding chairs are laid out facing a small stage where a group of about 20 locals are gathered. A row of drummers plays in the front, while elders teach the youth to dance. People of all ages shuffle in and out of the door in heavy winter clothes. Gideon Green is one of the regulars, doing our Eskimo dances and drumming. It takes your stress away, says Green. It takes my depression away when I'm hitting the drum. It just takes out all the anger. Back in 2015, a string of youth suicides rocked Hooper Bay. Many of those who died were among Green's peers. We had 3 suicides in less than a week, he reflects. Young Alaska Native men are among the nation's most disproportionately impacted demographics for suicide risk. Many village residents, including Green, pointed to a lack of healthy options for how young people could spend their time outside of school. We have to start doing our cultural activities, he recalls telling friends. So when he saw CanHR volunteers recruiting for Gunzavik, it felt like a natural fit. They got us some stuff so we could start with youth group Eskimo dance practice, he says. That's the dance practice that's still going on today in the Tribal Council building. It's one of many activities like beadwork or seal hunting that have been supported by the program. The thought behind these activists is threefold. First, it helps address a lack of options for how young people spend their idle time outside of school. Next, it provides a context for trained community volunteers to help instill healthy behaviors while fostering social connection. And a sense of shared purpose that research has shown protects against suicidal behavior. Finally, it provides a bridge for youth to reconnect with aspects of their cultural traditions that were eroded during the forced assimilation of residential schools during their parents' generations. In the eyes of Yupik's leaders, subsistence living provides valuable life skills for survival, connection, and self-worth. During interviews and conversations, village elders repeatedly told researchers from CanHR that facilitating opportunities for young people to spend time on the land was essential to supporting mental health. Our elders tell us that nature is our medicine, says Simon John, one of CanHR's local program coordinators. We're spiritually connected to everything: the land, air, water, and plants. When you're out berry picking or hunting, you can let go of what's bothering you. Youth are required to give away their first kill to elders and vulnerable members of the community, when John says to provide young hunters with direct and tangible sense of purpose. For Jerome Nukosuk, a high school student in Hooper Bay, spending time on the land serves as a reprieve for the challenges of the village. I feel at peace just hearing birds and enjoying nature. He says, at 17, Nukosuk has already lost 4 friends to suicide. When my closest friend passed in 2020, I didn't eat for 3 days. I didn't go to school for 2 weeks. Nukosuk was only 13 at the time. But when he saw CanHR staff recruiting for Gunsavik at school, he signed up. It really opened my eyes to a lot of opportunities, he recalls. The program gave Nukosuk the opportunity to learn new skills while making harpoons or fishing nets that he could use while out on the water. That really helped me through a lot of my suicide problems, just keeping my hands busy. Promising results, uncertain funding. Since the outset of the program, CanHR has been able to successfully identify and prescribe a robust series of activities. For some, like beading or dancing, it's been easier to get the necessary funding and approvals. But when it comes to activities like hunting that many communities identified as being essential, CanHR has faced greater challenges and complicated funding mechanisms that also made it hard to consistently implement a broad array of programs. Over the years, subsistence activities have become increasingly reliant on the cost of key supplies like fuel and ammunition. This can be present obstacles for many remote communities, where the added expense of air deliveries mean the common goods can cost more than 5 times the national average. For a region living on a median household income of roughly $42,000 per year, these costs can be prohibitive. A river bisects the village of Nunavut in Alaska's Yukos Delta. Located along the Bering Sea, the YK Delta has the highest rates of suicide in the United States. It is one of the country's most remote regions, with no physical infrastructure connecting its villages to the national road system. CanHR has tried to address that barrier by providing villages with access to vehicles and supplies. But the University of Alaska Fairbanks wouldn't let the program fund activities involving miners, firearms, and boating in the Arctic due to liability concerns. People from the Western world tried to come in and imply what works for them, and demand that this is a model that you're going to use. But a lot of the time it doesn't apply to us, because we do things differently out here, says Simon John. Sustainability is also a big challenge. Gunsavik receives federal grants that are typically funded on a 3 to 5 year cycle basis. This can be a problem for programs that seek to address complex, long-standing issues like suicide. Holly Wilcox, a national suicide prevention researcher and professor at Johns Hopkins University, says that this is a recurring issue for prevention programs across the country. It could be that you're just finally making momentum and able to do these things at high quality, and then the grant ends. CanHR lead investigator and the Gunsavik community organizer Simon John goes to collect water outside his maki, near his home in Tusuk Bay, Alaska. Historically, he says that the steam bath has played an important role in mental wellness within the community by providing neighbors with spaces to gather and share their concerns. CanHR has assisted regional tribal entities in applying for their own grants to continue funding the program locally, but this piecemeal approach has at times yielded uneven results, such as the case in Hooper Bay, whose Gunzavik program was temporarily halted despite widespread popularity after their Native Connections grant expired in September of last year. CanHR was able to assist the village in securing a new grant through the NIH in March, effectively resuming the program over a 6-month pause in services. These short funding cycles, along with the working among small populations, make it hard to measure whether the program has caused a drop in suicide deaths. But in 2 outcome papers, published in 2017 and 2022, respectively, CanHR was able to show that the program did help improve factors that reduce suicide risk over 2-year study periods. Additionally, other Native groups across the country, like the White Mountain Apache tribe, who have similar community prevention programs, have been able to demonstrate a reduction in suicide as much as 38.3% over 6 years. These promising results have left Rasmus and her colleagues feeling optimistic that their community-centric approach could be applied in other contexts. A group of soldiers from the 1st Brigade Combat Infantry Division marched in formation outside the Bat Set Military Hospital at Fort Wainwright in Fairbanks. In 2021, there were 17 suicides in the division, giving it one of the highest rates among the military unit nationwide. Purpose, identity, and grit. Through their work at the villages at the YK Delta, CanHR felt that they developed a process for identifying community strengths that could be used as a model elsewhere. Through interviews and collaboration with local leaders to identify cultural strengths, researchers felt they could design new programs and activities that helped to reinforce a strong sense of purpose, and in 2021, CanHR had their first opportunity to demonstrate their approach in a totally different group, the U.S. military. The University of the Yupik's approach is really a protective factors that approach, says Rasmus. Every community and culture has protective factors. In the late 2010s, deep within the Alaskan interior, military service members were killing themselves at astonishingly high rates. Suicide rates for military service members are roughly double that of their civilian peers, and among military populations over the last 5 years, Alaska's suicide rate was more than triple the national average. Despite persistent attention and investment, the problem wasn't getting better. I think about it every day, every time my phone rings, says Command Sergeant Maj Joe Gaskin in the U.S. Army's 11th Airborne Division. We're devastated every time these things happen. In 2022, Alaska Sens Lisa Murowski and Dan Sullivan successfully lobbied for additional funding to allocate toward military suicide prevention. Congress also directed the Department of Defense to investigate the high occurrence of suicides on remote, rural military installations like those in Alaska. These actions laid the groundwork for CanHR to receive their first grant in 2022 to start working with the 11th Airborne Division and begin to adapt the model they've developed through the Gonzavik within the military. The 11th Airborne Division's 1st Brigade is housed at Fort Wainwright in Fairbanks, just down the road from CanHR's office at the University of Alaska. Sticking with their philosophy of working in partnership with communities, CanHR staffed their internal team with military officers and worked closely with their Army counterparts to develop an approach. They started by identifying the challenges the group was facing. Military leaders said the unit suffered from a lack of identity. When I first got there, it was like a mass triage, says Maj General Brian Eifler, the unit's top commander. The worst thing you can have are people that don't know their purpose, he said. Years of fighting in desert wars left recruiters recruits wondering why they were going to such extreme lengths to train in Arctic combat. Soldiers felt isolated from their families in the lower 48 and were struggling to connect with their mission. What was needed, the military leaders felt, was a rebranding of sorts. Concurrent to CANHR's partnership, the Army unified its Alaska forces under the banner of the 11th Airborne Division and invested in building their identity as Arctic warfare specialists. CANHR worked with their military counterparts to design a new program. They started by interviewing division leadership to define the cultural strengths within the organization, and quickly honed in on three themes: purpose, identity, and grit. Gaskin, who helps to oversee the program, explains, if you fill soldiers' lives with purpose and identity, those corrosive behaviors like suicide and alcohol abuse start to delete themselves naturally. Next, they developed a series of training programs designed to empower junior leaders with the skills to prevent their soldiers connect with those core principles. The implementation of that training started to roll out this spring, allowing those trainees to start applying their newly developed skills within their units. Finally, they participated in community building activities, like lessons in preparing wild salmon, polar plunges that provided context in which those skills could be applied. Those activities also helped leaders connect soldiers with their peers and to build a sense of shared purpose. During a recent such community outing at a folk school in Fairbanks, soldiers learned to smoke salmon while volunteer leaders encouraged and the privates to get to know one another. An officer asked the assembled group, "Why did y'all join the Army?" Part of the thinking behind these activities is to create opportunities for conversation around topics like identity or the deeper meaning of serving in the armed forces, mostly because of family and to expand my reach as well, one of the soldiers replied. To become a stronger person mentally, said another. As the program continues, CANHR will gather data from participants and leaders that will help to further refine their approach and measure its effectiveness. They received their second grant in February to expand their research to include the Alaska National Guard and U.S. Coast Guard, as they continue to collect and analyze the data from the study's initial phases. Their aim is to present a model to the Department of Defense by the end of 2025 that can be used across the military. Gaskin says he thinks it's all making a difference. I lose sleep every night thinking about these kids that we've lost along the way. I think about their parents, their families. He pauses for a moment. We've got to protect what's left. A new paradigm. In the latest iteration of the National Suicide Prevention Strategy published by the U.S. Department of Health and Human Services in April, community-based suicide prevention was designated as the top strategy priority. Last year, U.S. Surgeon General Vivek Murthy released an advisory warning about our epidemic of loneliness and isolation, both of which are considered key risk factors for suicide. Within the 82-page treatise, Dr. Murthy praised the healing effects of social connection and community as a potential antidote. To Holly Wilcox, her professional peers, the federal government's emphasis on community prevention feels like a signal of a new paradigm. I actually think it's been long overdue, she says. We really need to be focusing on more upstream, community-based public health approaches to this major and leading cause of death. In addition to its other strengths, Wilcox feels that the programs like Gunzavik, which leverage peers and paraprofessionals within local communities, may offer potential blueprint to address the shortfalls in the mental health care workforce that have been a persistent problem nationwide. Many of us are thinking, can we engage people with lived experience that we can train, she asked. They're from the same neighborhoods. They know the land in terms of the resources and supports that are most engaging and effective in their own community. And they can develop a rapport with folks because they've walked in their shoes. As the president of the International Academy of Suicide Prevention, Wilcox sees the greater potential for this emergent model. Outside the U.S., CANHR has collaborated with indigenous groups from Canada, Greenland, Norway, and Siberia. the circumpolar nations that represent some of the world's highest rates of suicide. But according to Wilcox, a number of barriers still stand in the way of widespread implementation of this approach. She says that research organizations and the government agencies that fund prevention programs often operate in silos. While research might be supported to a certain model, it might not be prioritized by funders or decision makers. Wilcox also feels that sustainable funding streams for community-based prevention programs will be necessary to establish momentum and longevity for local efforts. Funding streams that are not reliant on grants and contracts, but are more part of the background infrastructure, are ideal, she says. Wilcox wants to see more groups around the country seize the opportunity to deliver programs that follow this approach. With the increased attention from the federal government, she's feeling more hopeful that they might.